Once again, Lee Strobel has a highly educated scholar who states there is scientific evidence that's going to convince me of the legitimacy of the resurrection of Christ and his divinity. Will this be the evidence that makes me reconvert? Stay tuned and we'll find out. If you've been following along, you know I have no like for one Mr. Lee Strobel. I read his first edition book of The Case for Christ a long time ago, long before we had the ability to fact check him so easily, and I was greatly convinced by a lot of what he had to say. I dare say it pushed me back into Christianity in the early 2000s. I was still skeptical, yes, but was greatly leaning towards its legitimacy. Well over a decade and a half later, when I read his second edition of The Case for Christ, this time the fact checks I could easily perform didn't add up with this case at all. And if you see in my playlist, I'm taking down not only every interviewee, but every claim every interviewee states, the vast majority of which were hardline fundamentalists. And for this episode, I'm taking apart the late Dr. John McRay. And I did a pretty extensive search on Dr. McRay and could not put a finger on whether he was a fundamentalist or not, but he is certainly cut from their fabric. And like all of Strobel's interviewees, he's highly educated. He has a PhD, and in his obituary I looked up, stated that he was a preacher as well. He was also a professor, highly acclaimed, publisher of many written works, and Lee Strobel describes him as the go-to guy for biblical accuracy when in question. I'm not sure about that. For if you stay to the end of the video, I'm going to show you a huge blunder that Dr. McRay made, as well as Lee Strobel for not following up with a standard fact check, which again calls into question whether Strobel was really an atheist when he conducted this interview in the early 80s. But here's Dr. McRay's contentions for the legitimacy of Christ's divinity, matching exactly what the Bible said. Well, the first is the existence of a place called Nazareth, which has been hotly debated among scholars. Well, it seems that there is archaeological evidence that exists that shows there was a very small type of dwelling that could have been the ancient Nazareth. But there's no archaeological evidence that suggests Jesus was born in Bethlehem. There's actually no archaeological evidence that the man even existed, although I believe he did, and so do most scholars. So I'll give agreement to that to Dr. McRay, but I'm also going to give that it's not really relevant whether Christ was divine or not. Again, like most of Lee Strobel's interviewees thus far, showing the legitimacy of an historical place does not prove the supernatural. It certainly doesn't prove divinity of Yeshua, and it definitely doesn't prove a resurrection from the dead. And this is the whole problem with Dr. McRay's contention. He's trying to show that the portrayal of the supernatural in the New Testament is more and more confirmed by the existence of certain historical sites during that time that are in the New Testament. He tries to use this logical fallacy with the Gospel of Luke, in which the Gospel of Luke referred to a ruler of a certain province, which many scholars thought was incorrect and found later that the Gospel was actually right concerning this ruler being there at the time. And what Dr. McRay is trying to say is if Luke is accurate with certain rulers and historical sites, just like when there's the mentioning of the Pool of Siloam and Jacob's Well, only in the last few decades have we discovered that these historical sites do match the biblical texts. So Dr. McRay's endpoint is because Luke was right about these historical sites and the certain rulers that were once questionable, therefore he must be right about all the supernatural claims in the Gospel of Luke. Well, first of all, we don't know who wrote Luke. Luke was written well after the time of Yeshua. And second, again, it's that logical fallacy of certain sites exists, so therefore the divinity of Yeshua is legitimate, because that's also in the Gospel of Luke. It's an incredibly weak argument that Strobel should have taken apart immediately, if he was an atheist. And then Dr. McRay goes on to confirm the legitimacy of Herod's slaughter of the firstborn after Yeshua was born, as depicted in the New Testament as well. And this slaughter of the firstborn is in the Gospel of Matthew. Well, here's what we don't have, Dr. McRay. If you were alive to hear this rebuttal, we don't have this story mentioned anywhere else. It's not mentioned in any of the surviving works of a man named Nicholas of Damascus, who was a close personal friend of Herod the Great. It's not mentioned by Josephus, who recorded in very fine detail King Herod's murderous nature, including his own 3 sons. Simply put, we have no writing anywhere that confirms this except the Gospel of Matthew. That claim is not only questionable, It isn't even worth considering. But Dr. McRay's answer in the interview was it's reasonable, because Herod was a monster. Same thing an article in the Catholic Register said. King Herod was a monster, killed his own family, so he must have done it. How can a former legal journalist of expert level, someone who was highly acclaimed as a legal journalist, simply nod his head and say it makes sense to him as he did in that interview? But here's the big blunder that Dr. McRay made, which really makes me just toss the whole interview out right there. He tries to prove the legitimacy of the story of Bethlehem, in other words, where Christ was born, by confirmation of a census in which Mary and Joseph would have had to travel back to Bethlehem to participate in, thus showing this is where Yeshua originated at his birth, and thus confirming the New Testament story of the matter. According to my sources at the time, during this census, the reigning governor of the area of Syria, who is mentioned by Luke as reigning during the census, was a man named Quirinius. And the problem modern scholars have, most modern scholars, is that Quirinius ruled approximately 6 AD. So the problem is, the Gospel of Luke mentions this governor as reigning during the time of the census, which doesn't match the timeline when Christ was born. And this is where Dr. McRay made an amateur-level blunder, which makes me discount anything he had to say at all from here. He was quoted in the interview in Case for Christ 2nd edition of an archaeologist who was a professor at the university who found coins with microletters etched on them that stated this man Quirinius was ruling even back to 11 BC. So because he was ruling this far back, the Gospel of Luke account with the census taken would have matched during the time when Christ was born. That professor he's talking about is Jerry Vardaman. I can't remember whether the first edition for the Case for Christ mentioned Professor Vardaman in the John McRay interview. However, after the book was published, Lee Strobel took heat for this. And the reason he took heat is because Jerry Vardaman was completely debunked by pretty much every scholar out there. He was known as a Christian eccentric, Baptist by trade, fundamentalist by nature. Jerry Vardaman never submitted this awesome publication for peer review and never confirmed as legitimate at all. As a matter of fact, the majority consensus of scholars outside of fundamentalism was that it was completely bunk to begin with. And this was a big part of Lee Strobel's interview with Dr. McRay, showing the legitimacy of the story of Christ matching the New Testament exactly. Lee, your interviewee based this legitimacy on a complete fraud. And it is all over the place, and you can do an easy Google search and quickly confirm the illegitimacy of Jerry Vardaman's findings. And my point is, not that Dr. McRay was completely incorrect about the matter. My point is, where was Lee Strobel's fact-checking on this contention? Basically, he did none. So, Christian fundamentalists, when you point to the book The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, here is another example of an interview where the so-called legitimacy of the divinity of Christ was based on nothing but bad speculation, pure conjecture, and complete untruths. And if you'd like to see more debunking of interviews, where I clean his pseudo-scholastic clock, check out the playlist at the end of the video. And check out something I admit is a work of fiction, The Second Fall, an offbeat apocalypse sure to offend the evangelical and probably everyone else. Links are on the video description as well as the banner, and I will see you next time as we once again take that sword of reason and reality and thrust it right through the heart of ignorance.